We're continuing with our discussion of Lacan's notion of the death drive. And we're going to pick up a question that we ended with last time. The question was this: having traced various of Slavoj Zizek's interpretations and helpful, very instructive readings of the Lacanian death drive, we arrived at the question, which I've left here on the bottom of the chalkboard. We seem to have some kind of vacillation in many of the Zizekian descriptions of death drive. On the one hand, we have this use of Hegelian terminology, whereby we start to think about death drive as an instance of self-relating negativity. I'm supposed to have negativity up there. It seems to work quite well. The negativity has been rubbed out. But self-relating negativity, negative inherence, constitutive gap. In these descriptions, death drive is negativity. But on the other hand, we have these moments, and Freud's writing is certainly full of them, where death drive is not so much ontological gap type of negativity, but it seems to be very clearly a surplus, a type of psychological excess. So one is tempted to say, well, which one is it? Is it this ontological failure, this negative inherence, this ontological gap, or is it a type of excess, a type of too muchness? And what we're going to try and do in this installment of our talks is try to motivate for how it certainly needs to be thought of in some terms as a surplus, as an excess. Indeed, we want to think about how death drive evokes this notion of an indestructible type of life. Now, right at the beginning of the talks, and I've left this on the chalkboard, these 4 points right at the top, we made a list of the crucial, everyday, commonplace notions of what the Freudian notion of the death drive seems to imply, and we were very careful to say these are all the reasons that the Lacanian death drive is different to that. And one of them that we suggested was that we're not looking at an impulse to self-annihilation. We're not looking at a kind of impulse to organic demise. We're not looking at an impulse to a kind of inertia. And that's why it's important that we return to this theme of indestructible life, because you could say that if anything, what one starts to witness in moments of death drive infused activity is actually precisely something like a type of indestructible life. So to do this, we will again draw on Slavoj Zizek, and we'll look at a couple of his very useful terms. He mentions this idea of excess life, and he wants to suggest when talking about death drive that there's something here which persists beyond life. Something which is indeed an excess, a pressure, a kind of compulsion, which persists beyond the everyday, ordinary confines of life. We could say that it's a compulsion. And we can also say, and here's a nice philosophical moment, that clearly Lacan of the 1950s is in some ways influenced by and responding to the work of Martin Heidegger. It's a theme we've touched on a few times. Zizek interestingly tracks this kind of comparison, where on the one hand we've got the Heideggerian interest in death and this future forward momentum, this being towards death, and hence in Heideggerian philosophy, Heidegger's ontology, we have a strong theme of finitude, of the fact that the human subject will die, and that they're able to comprehend this, and that their life is thus characterized by a kind of finitude. So you could say this being towards death might have seemed an interesting theme that may have informed Lacan in some ways. Now, while there may be moments of this, you could say that the stark comparison, the contrast between the two is more telling. So whereas we have this underlining of finitude, of the fact that life will end, and that this is somehow definitive of the human subject's life and their subjectivity for Heidegger, with Lacan, you could say that it's not so much just that there's finitude, rather you could say that there's something which overruns finitude, something which exceeds life. And it helps here to go all the way down. I'll work our way through these various quotes and ideas on the board, but I like Mari Ruti tries to, a scholar, a psychoanalytically influenced, Levinas influenced critical theorist, uses a series of nice synonyms, descriptions to try to understand what we're talking about here, to try to illuminate something of this theme of indestructible life. She talks about surplus vitality. She talks about excessive energy. She's referring here, I don't think she uses this term, she's referring to this idea of the libidinal animation that makes us, well, not just makes us human, but that in a sense defines human subjectivity in its most profound animations, its agitations, its motivations, to be invested in something, to do something, to have some kind of dedication, to have some kind of gratifications and goals and aims in life. Here, in many ways, I think she's responding to some of the language we find in Lacanian secondary literature, particularly Zizek. But what does she mean when she starts talking about this surplus vitality, this excessive energy, this bodily agitation? And two concepts are going to be crucial here if we're going to understand how death drive involves this type of excess, this type of surplus. And those two terms are drive, number one, and jouissance, number two. Now, the one immediately important conceptual move here is to say we've been talking about death drive. And in as much as we think about death drive, we often foreground death, inertia, demise, the end of life, annihilation, destruction, all of those terms that normally go along with it. But the key Lacanian move here would be to say death drive is a form of drive. And if we do it in that way, it's not so much simply that we need to emphasize death drive, but it's more like death drive. And if we're able to start getting our head around that, what we're talking about here is fundamentally those drive impulses that characterize human subjectivity's dedication, wish, motivation, investment, activity in certain gratifying investments and tasks which human beings are willing to pursue beyond the limits of what is good for them, beyond the limits of what is everyday, ordinary norms and understandings of whatever well-being, one's own biological best interests. Then we're starting to understand something important. Drive is crucial here. And of course, we've mentioned it already, but for Lacan, all drives, all of these impulses that entail some kind of activity, some kind of libidinal enjoyment, some infused jouissance moments from pursuing certain, often quite senseless seeming activities, those are all instances of drive, and all instances of drive are by definition potentially moments of death drive because they push towards a certain kind of excess. Now, to properly contextualize this material, it would help if you've looked at some of the lectures that we've already prepared on the topic of jouissance. But even if you haven't, I will try to illustrate some of the key points here. But I suppose what we're really trying to get to here is we want to introduce a Freudian term. A Freudian term that Lacan is sometimes quite ambivalent about. It's libido. Lacan is often quite ambivalent about this concept because it starts to sound libido, a little bit organic, a little bit physical, a little bit bodily, a little bit biological. And Lacan doesn't want to rely on that type of conceptualization or theorization. But two important moves that he does want to make here. Number one, he introduces a myth called the myth of the lamella. That I'm going to focus on in a separate mini lecture all of its own. So we won't introduce it here, we'll just name check it. But he's going to have to engage with this Freudian concept because it's really important. Libido here is the kind of animating impulse, often thought of as a kind of life force, a sexualized life force of the subject. So he'll say, let's think about lamella. He'll be a little bit cautious about how he wants to theorize it for the reasons that I've just mentioned. But the other response, this is kind of the basic Lacanian response to the Freudian concept of libido, is to say when Freud needs to theorize something and utilizes this notion of libido, the kind of investments, that the sexualized investments that the subject has in various facets of their life or activities, Lacan will turn to the notion of jouissance. So just to make those two quick points. But now that we've made those points, let's foreground a further quote from Zizek and try to do this explanatory work, which will involve thinking about death drive and how death drive always, as it were, represents something of a knot that exists between the libido and the death drive. Or, as Yanis Stavrakakis has put it. I've tried to give his quote here. He says that the concept of jouissance reveals that there's a knot between the libido and death drive. So what I'm trying to suggest here is that if we're going to understand death drive, we need to understand that it is drive, and we also need to understand something of the inheritance of this idea of libido. So as we do that, let's look back at one further phrase that I've yanked straight out of Zizek. We've looked at some of these terms: excess life, pressure which persists beyond life. We're talking about drive and its relationship to the libidinal gratifications of jouissance. But here's a nice term, and again here, I think that there's a kind of subterranean engagement with Heidegger. So Zizek talks about the ontological derailment that throws being out of joint. So maybe it's not so subterranean. It's pretty explicit, actually, that he's dealing with Heidegger. He wants to make the argument that there is something which throws the subject, that throws being, the subjectivity of the subject and their location within a natural realm, out of joint. And this repeated theme of the subject being out of joint with their environment, of course, is very Freudian. It's also very Lacanian, hence the notion of the real. But there's this idea that there's always this friction, this potentiality of being out of joint. Now, on the one hand, you may say this is a thematics that comes up again and again, and it's interesting, but what really underlies it? And of course, we've already introduced it in some ways, but let's reiterate it in a slightly different way. One of the reasons that there is always this potentiality of being out of joint is that there's, you could say, a kind of discordance between the biological body and the drives, the impulses, the enjoyments that one pursues being a human subject with the body. In other words, to keep it as simple as possible, we enjoy certain or get gratifications from certain activities which are not good for us. And if we have this idea that there's a fundamental discordance between the body and the drives, the things and the enjoyments that they get, you could start to see that you could say that part of what characterizes the human condition as such is being out of joint, or the potentiality of being out of joint. So when Zizek talks about this potentiality, or maybe it's more than a potentiality, maybe it's a characterizing feature of human subjectivity, being that of disruption, the derailment, and again, he's got a nice philosophical set of terms here, ontological derailment, that throws being out of joint. This negative tendency to disruption is nothing other than libido. Now, of course, when I found this moment in Zizek, I seized upon it because he himself doesn't use libido very often for some of the reasons that we've just said. But there's a nice linking here, and it helps us to start to respond to some of the questions that we had right at the beginning. If there is some kind of ontological derailment, okay, we've spoken about negative inherence, about the death drive. Here we're now thinking about some kind of ontological derailment, which is a nice terminological choice. Part of what it animates that, makes it possible, whether we're talking about the ontological derailment or being out of joint, is libido. Libido is what throws the subject out of joint. Libido in Freudian terms, enjoyments, excess enjoyments, passions, you could say, or in more Lacanian terms, what throws the subject out of joint is the traumatic encounter with jouissance. And there's a really basic kind of stupid image that we could just throw out there to help make this point. It's a kind of anecdotal or proverbial thing, don't pick the scab. You could say that what we're starting to look at here is, maybe it's too reductive, too simplistic an example, but it's a helpful one. If you do have a scab, now I'm trying to find some injury, you know, there's some kind of jouissance, there's some kind of gratification in picking away at the scab. And you know it's not good for you, because presumably, instinctually, in terms of self-preservation, the best thing to do is let your body heal. But there is this kind of unholy drive, this animating force where we get some jouissance out of a certain activity, which in some respects is self-destructive, and we continue to do it. Sometimes there's a repetitive short circuit where we get stuck in doing these things which are by definition bad for us. So let's start to draw to a little bit of a conclusion here, but I want to just throw out a couple of nice characterizations of jouissance. And what we're starting to find now is we had a whole series of lectures on jouissance. where we may have name-checked the death drive once or twice. But what we're now starting to realize is that the death drive and jouissance are very intimately connected. And we, in a way, we wouldn't properly be able to theorize jouissance without making reference to the death drive. Because jouissance, the gratifications that we find from various transgressive, non-self-preservative, beyond the pleasure principle activities, is precisely the domain of jouissance. So we've already given Yanis Stavrakakis' idea that jouissance shows that there is a kind of knot between libidinally satisfying, gratifying activities and the death drive. We see a similar kind of notion in Lacan himself. In Seminar 17, he offers us this comment: the path towards death is nothing other than jouissance. And when we find a quote like that in Lacan, we can pretty much be sure that it's a refurbished, refreshed Freudian idea. And the Freud idea, which Lacan seems to be riffing on, repeating here, is this idea: even the subject's destruction of himself can't take place without some kind of libidinal satisfaction. Even the subject's destruction of themselves can't take place without some kind of satisfaction. Self-destructive acts entail a mode of jouissance, which you could say sustains them. Which means, I think, also that we can talk about an economy of jouissance, which is going to be crucial for understanding the death drive. Another nice Freud phrase, quote, citation, comes from Civilization and its Discontents: death drive eludes our perception unless tinged with eroticism. So again, we've come across this in some of the earlier lectures, but we're finding that there's an intimate connection, not only between death drive and jouissance, but between libido, or what is sexual, and what is traumatic, or what is excessive. We see this time and time again. So let's now just think about how to conclude. We can make the point, which we've already made, that one way of approaching the drive in psychoanalysis, and certainly death drive, is via the notion that there is a kind of important denaturalization. What does that mean? It sounds very dramatic, but this denaturalization essentially means that because we are able to find certain gratifications, certain moments of enjoyable suffering, jouissance, we pursue a variety of activities and indulgences which are beyond our self-preserving, self-best interests, which are beyond the instinctual remit of how we should govern our lives if we were, as it were, merely animals. But of course, we're not. So this moment of denaturalization, and we've also emphasized the idea before about a kind of discordance between body and drive, is what characterizes human subjectivity. This is, again, a way of replicating the fact that humans are drive-driven entities. Drive, all drives being potentially death drives, in as much as they can take us beyond the parameters of life-sustaining, healthy activities. Let's end then with this fascinating, intriguing, and somewhat perhaps disturbing idea that maybe we need a whole series of lectures on just what drive is, and perhaps that's what I'll start with next time. But let's also just end with this idea that drive is asubjective. Zizek is very insistent on this point, as is Lacan. Drive is asubjective. What does that mean? Sometimes in the literature we see this idea that drive is a kind of acephalous force. In other words, it's a kind of animation, a kind of animating, agitating force or energy that, again, is defining of the human condition as such. If we had to imagine a human subject with no drive, with no libidinal animation, presumably they'd be a bit of an automaton. So this does seem to be characteristic of what it means to be human. But acephalous means headless. Asubjective means that the drive is, as I put it here, citing Zizek, neither psychological, neither an instance of psychological expression, nor an attribute of the subject. It's not something that the subject, as it were, owns. Rather, it is a kind of animating force which the subject is caught up in. It's not an attribute of the subject, and the subject doesn't necessarily, it's not a subcategory of the subjective. It is asubjective. It is something which is within the body, within that it animates the subject, and in a sense might make the subject. But in an odd sort of way, and hence the terminology asubjective, it is not a subcategory of subjectivity. It's not a subcategory of the subject. So one of our questions which we should answer in the next lecture is, what does this mean? What is this asubjective force? And how can we then think drive as something which is not, as it were, simply owned or controlled or a subcategory of the subject, but it is something which, as it were, overrides the subject? Let's end with that question.